Hi, I've started a new book, and I don't want to review the book so much as just kind of relay some of the insights I think it's worthy of. The book is "Forced into Glory: Abraham Lincoln's White Dream" by Leron Bennett, and I believe I bought this book a few months ago. I think it was referenced by Tom DiLorenzo. Now, Tom DiLorenzo is kind of made a name for himself as a contemporary Lincoln critic. Obviously, he comes from the libertarian perspective, so he's going to criticize, Lincoln for tariffs and for being a tyrant and for violating states' rights and violating the Constitution. And as an aside, he would always also add, well, he also was a racist and hated the Indians. Anything he did about Native Americans was to basically commit genocide against him. And contrary to the myth, to the image that just about everybody seems to accept verbatim, he was not some great friend of African Americans. He was perhaps against slavery, but certainly not an abolitionist. And that's something that, some people will acknowledge. Like, well, he wasn't really like a Horace Greeley type or a Lloyd Garrison type or a Frederick Douglass type, but, at least he was against slavery. And he basically ended slavery through his acts as president. And, Lorenzo would kind of question that. Now, he referenced this book as being basically, I think it was Tom DiLorenzo, it may have been somebody else, as just being a detailed chronicle of Lincoln being racist. Now, the author of this book, Leron Bennett, and there he is on the back, is not a libertarian. He doesn't care anything about libertarianism. He's not even a classical liberal. In fact, one thing I noticed reading this book is there's many points where I'm like, okay, what he just said is absurd, because he favors reparations. He's a collectivist. He's very ethnocentric. Basically, he repeatedly says that American slavery is the worst crime in history. And while I'm prepared to say it's a very terrible crime, it's kind of hard to aggregate crimes like this. But if you do, I have a hard time concluding that American slavery was the worst. We're talking maximum 4 million slaves overall of history, probably less than double that. And we have genocides in the 20th century of more than that many people being killed. And not only that, not spread over 200 or 400 years, 350 years or whatever, but within just a decade or a few years. And I have a hard time viewing the murder of a person as being less bad than the enslavement of a person. I guess an argument can be made, but I think most slaves, by their choices, indicate that they prefer slavery to death because they don't kill themselves. Although a few of them did. He recounts tales of people who did. And it's hard to debate with those people, but then that's only a tiny, tiny number who actually make that choice. Whereas in a genocide, none of them chose that. They were all forced. And apparently, I disagree with that. I think that shows extreme ethnocentrism on his part. The other problem I have is he favors reparations. That doesn't make any sense to me. And many of his claims, I kind of can laugh at. He says, when are we going to get our 40 acres and a mule? As if white people in the United States, when they landed, they were all given 40 acres and a mule. I'm not one of those people who just considers the colonization of the North American continent, or the South American continent for that matter, as just the inevitable, inexorable, and what glorious march of civilization. Certainly not. But then to categorize it as, everything that people have in America they stole or they got for free makes no sense at all. If they got anything from they were much more likely to get well-aimed arrows from the Indians than they were to get any capital or any property. In fact, if we were to only have what the Indians left us or we stole from them, we would still be living in teepees and wigwams, and we wouldn't be having a Skype or a YouTube discussion about it because there wouldn't be any. I remember having this discussion in college. I actually had dinner with a gay guy who actually somehow knows Bradley Manning, and I tried to ask him about that, and he never would say. But this was before the whole thing with Bradley Manning started, so I don't know. They knew each other somehow. Anyway, we were sitting in a food court in college, and he said, well, we stole everything from the Indians, And I said, really? So Do you think all of this, looking around, all this infrastructure, all this capital was, all these buildings, do you think all this was just sitting here 400 years ago waiting for us to steal? He goes, well, no. I mean, so did the Indians, did we force the Indians to build it? No. I mean, white people built it. It doesn't, or people built it. I shouldn't say white people. People built it, and the idea that, we took it from the Indians. You could say the land was stolen, but you'd have to do that on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes the Indians gave it away. Sometimes the Europeans simply moved into an area where there weren't any Indians any longer, maybe because they were all run off by the government, or maybe because they died of a disease, which is not really a malicious act, especially when you have no concept of germology, which they didn't, especially early on. When you get later, that's a different story. But the population wipeouts, the democides of the Native Americans happened before the Europeans had any clue what was happening in terms of disease. Anyway, be that as it may, Mr. Bennett here also has something of a name for himself in terms of criticizing Abraham Lincoln. He first came out with an article in the ethnocentric magazine Ebony back in 1968, basically criticizing Lincoln as a racist, as a white, not just a racist, as a white supremacist. And, I haven't gotten all the way through it, but actually I've only just started. I think I'm only about 100 pages in. His argument's pretty straightforward. All we have to do is read what Lincoln said and wrote, and read what his close confidants and friends said about him. And we quickly discover not only did he frequently say racist things and white supremacist things, that he never spoke of egalitarianism in terms of the races. In fact, his most famous statements in his first and his second inaugural in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he says, "I am not for emancipating the slaves, and I will go further than that. I will say that there is a physical difference between whites and blacks, and that whites are superior to blacks, and that and that we cannot live together in harmony." And his plan was gradual, remunerative emancipation, which is to say, yes, slowly over time, get slaves out of slavery, and do that by paying their masters, and then send them away, preferably to Africa. Don't allow them to stay in the United States. So he was a white supremacist, a racist, a segregationist, and only nominally even an emancipationalist, if that's a word. It's not. An abolitionist. And that, he has no statements to the contrary of that. And Lincoln historians are essentially engaging in they don't really dispute this. They don't say, yeah, he never said those things, but what they do is, what the debate is, and he says that what is his alibi? And so many Lincoln apologists, who are very famous historians, you want to be a famous historian, be an expert on Abraham Lincoln, he's, one of those uber popular figures like Hitler, like FDR. There's just a handful of historical figures that just, there's a high demand, there's a high market value for anything that has to do with them. And yeah, you can become the expert on William Pierce or James Buchanan or Henry Clay or, Frederick Douglass even, and whatever. Abraham Lincoln, you'll be interviewed, book deals, it's a big deal. And not just him, FDR, Adolf Hitler, whatnot. Anyway, he says, the only debate's on the alibi, and so the main criticism is, well, he was just talking to be like a white supremacist and a racist to get elected. He was just lying, essentially. Which is interesting, because then it's the same guy, oh, Abraham Lincoln's so honest. But this kind of becomes a non-falsifiable claim at a point. Now, it would be one thing if 50% of his statements were, pro-black, and 50% of his statements were racist, and that's like, oh, I don't know, it's a mix. He's kind of like the Rand Paul of the Civil War. You're not really sure. At some point, he's a warmonger. At some points, he seems like a libertarian. I don't know. Maybe there's room for a conspiracy theory here. Maybe not. With Lincoln, there's none of that, because there is no other quotes. There have been some famous letters that were shown to be forgeries, but other than that, no. He's always, like with the Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't want to do it. Congress was essentially doing it already, and he was faced with the task of losing the war. There was a big fear that if he didn't do that, Britain and France would enter the war on the side of the South, which up to that point was doing fairly well, at least in the East. And this was a very shrewd political move to say, okay, England and France, if you go to war with us, we're against slavery. So what are you, for slavery? He basically made it impossible for them to enter the war, and that's the reason he did it. And then he spent the rest of the war apologizing, especially to people in border states, like, I'm sorry, I don't want to really end slavery. And he even would say, look, and this is the famous part about the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't actually free any slaves. It exempted all areas controlled by the North, so the particular parishes in Louisiana, the sections of Virginia, all the border states, the entire state of Tennessee. I don't know what the justification there is. Tennessee was in full rebellion, but he exempted Tennessee. And so he was saying, well, all the slaves in the South that he couldn't actually free, they were free. So this is like him, proclaiming that all the slavery and serfdom is ended in Russia. When he, well, did he actually end serfdom? No, not any serfs that were released had nothing to do with Lincoln. What Lincoln might have said, any more than any slaves who might have escaped. And this is what the author points out: the slaves who became free were the ones who just got up and left, and had nothing to do with Lincoln's proclamation one way or another. And then he even went on to start telling people, look, it's a war measure, and this is a very, very similar thing that happened in the Civil War for a lot of measures. People said, look, it's a war measure. Once the war is over, it's not legal anymore, and basically these people will be, to be given your freedom is called manumission. I don't know what the opposite of it would be. Unmanumissioned. It would be returned basically to slavery, very likely by the courts. And he was basically saying, I think that's what's going to happen, and I think that's what should happen. This is a war measure. This is like a punishment of criminals who are committing treason against the government. But once the punishment's over, they should have their property back. And then we'll get to a gradual, remunerative emancipation, which he was saying would take at least 40, 50 years, even 100. So yeah, into the 1960s. That's what Abraham Lincoln was thinking in terms of ending slavery. Now, that's all well and good, and interesting in and of itself. But I think what the more interesting point is this kind of shows the priorities of those who exonerate and deify Lincoln, especially liberals. But actually, he's kind of a joint deity now. FDR and Lincoln both have kind of joined the ranks that both parties essentially treat them as demigods, and just that in and of itself is a good enough reason to attack them, because nobody should be placed on a platform that high, especially when they're invoked to justify government power. So that makes it a very good reason to tear down these sacred cows. Now, calling Lincoln not just racist, but a white supremacist and a segregationist, and proving it, is a very good way to do that. Now, I'm not interested in simply assassinating Abraham Lincoln's character. I think there's a broader point to be made here. But Tom De Lorenzo and Joe Sobran and a couple others are really good about that, because they say, look at all these tyrannical things he did. On the other hand, all that states' rights stuff, that kind of goes over a lot of people's heads, and they're just going to be like, well, you're just criticizing him for doing things that I already believe in. If you're going to criticize Lincoln and say, well, he's against states' rights, well, I'm against states' rights, so I'm not going to really back down from my support of Lincoln. But if you come out and say, well, Lincoln was a racist and he wanted to keep people in slavery, and he ordered his generals to keep people in slavery, and he refused to give equal pay to black soldiers, and he refused to have them be used as prisoner exchanges, which basically meant that they would be put to death by the Confederacy, unlike white soldiers. That's something that they might, that is kind of bad, because racism is this might be the single most red flag, automatically politically incorrect, death, automatic kill switch that there is out there. And Lincoln is worse than any Klan member. There's nobody that in contemporary society who even comes close to Lincoln. And he points out in the book, look, I'm not going to compare him to MLK or Nelson Mandela, because that's not a fair comparison. The world's different. So let's compare him to contemporary mid to late 19th century American society. And he comes out at best as a conservative moderate. All right, not even, he basically says everybody in his cabinet, even very racist ones, were better in their ideas on how to treat black people and how to approach the slavery issue than he was. He this is very, I think it is very clear that Lincoln was much more interested in preserving the Union than he was in helping blacks. He didn't even care about helping blacks. His ideas about emancipation had more to do with religious views, potentially. The white people are going to go to hell, and also they're mixing their race. There's miscegenation. They're race mixing. It's bad for the economy. Kind of not the moral things that are normally seen as reasons to be against slavery, but more it's an annoying practice that I don't like. Not it's tautologically evil. So using race to assassinate his character is useful, and he deserves to have his character assassinated, just like he deserved to actually be assassinated. Now, he wasn't assassinated for the emancipation; he was assassinated for all of the tyranny stuff. Hence the famous phrase that there's two interpretations of what he said, but he said "Sic semper tyrannis," thus ever to tyrants. Supposedly, what was uttered at the murder of Caesar, although I rather doubt that. He was a tyrant, so he got executed. It's tyrannicide. If you want to be a tyrant, you have to basically live with the chance that that's happening. But his character should be assassinated also. A, because it deserves it, and B, because his status is used such that, okay, we can just invoke him and that's a good enough argument. And this is similar to someone like MLK. Well, MLK was in favor of this, so you can't really debate it. Well, not so much, because that would imply that MLK or Lincoln or FDR are omniscient or omnipotent, not omnipotent, but omniscient beings, perfect beings, and whatever they thought is axiomatically correct. And it's just, that's patently false, but that's the premise of making arguments based on what their opinion was. And so character assassination is really good for people. I place Lincoln probably highest on this list because he has the most impeccable character for some reason. FDR would be very high on this list. And then, MLK, I used to be more gung-ho about assassinating his character. I'm less so now just because I kind of mellowed out on the whole war thing, and I think his anti-war stance was enough of a redemption to make up for all the warmongering and plagiarism and communism and whatever. But maybe not the communist, social, whatever you want to call it. But I think that the other thing is the worship of Lincoln really illustrates the priorities of those who worship him. Because the contradiction is most obvious with liberals. Liberals like to talk like racism is the worst thing that can be imagined. That having racism in your heart, having racist political policies, that basically makes you persona non grata. That makes you a pariah, an absolutely dismissible, contemptible character. And yet they love Abraham Lincoln. But Abraham Lincoln is a demonstrable racist bigot, a white supremacist who favored radical segregation, not just like Malcolm X, we want to own our own businesses, like go to fucking Africa or Haiti or somewhere far away. Mexico's too close, Canada's too close. Get the fuck out of here, never come back, and by the way, pay your own way out. So it's interesting because if they really believed in racism, if that was really their primary, basis for having a political ideology, then they would condemn Lincoln, but they don't, because racism is secondary to their main sacred cow, their number one religion, which is government power. And this is where Lincoln is so important, because he is the first champion of government power. You have like Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists and other presidents before this. Even Andrew Jackson in a couple ways was very much into government power. He was just against government power and finance, which is, I'll take that. But it's but this is a guy, the thing that liberals really hate is pluralism and states' rights, which I'm not a huge states' rights fan, but that's what they really hate. And the fact that Lincoln is a racist doesn't matter, because where it counts, when it comes to federal power, that's what he gets high marks. He gets the greatest marks of anybody. He did more against states' rights and more for federal power than anybody. I mean, and so that's, I think it demonstrates where their priorities lie. And there are exceptions, like this guy, Leron Bennett. He's he is a conscientious liberal. He's the type who says, okay, well, I agree with, the South was bad. He probably agrees with the Civil War. He agrees with, that. But Lincoln is a racist, and Lincoln is a white supremacist. And so not only is that annoying, that's bad enough that he's going to condemn Lincoln and say, fuck that guy. We should all hate him. And he's written this huge book, condemning the man. And he doesn't get a free pass because of, the Homestead Act or whatever. And this is very similar to contemporary liberals who, oh yeah, they like civil liberties and they don't like torture and they don't like war. But then when Obama's elected, all that's okay. And they either become enthusiastic supporters or they rationalize it or they just say, I don't really care anymore. And of course, there are exceptions. Glenn Greenwald is a real man, and he's really a liberal, or Cenk Unger, those two come to mind. They really are upset about the war, and more so with Glenn. Glenn's willing to say, look, whatever I might or may not agree with his social policy, what he's doing in terms of civil liberties and in terms of the war is automatically invalidates him as a potential leader. He is a criminal. You don't get to redeem yourself. There's no, I'm going to do this on the side and it compensates. That's it. It's too bad. And Cenk Unger, I don't think he goes that far, but at least he criticizes them for it. But the other thing about liberals is they're majoritarian. And so the fact that there's a few liberals on the margins who are conscientious about, say, the racism of Lincoln or the fascism of Obama, they're on the margins, they're outnumbered, so it doesn't really matter. They're outliers. The true philosophy is one of government power, and this makes perfect sense because if you believe that the state is a panacea for problems, or if not a panacea, because the panacea would imply that it's a solution to every single problem, and I think there's probably plenty of liberals who wouldn't say that the state's the solution to every problem, but for every problem that there is a solution, the government has to play some role, and maybe a central or vital role in that. And if you believe that, if your solution to every problem, poverty, well, the government should do this. Oh, well, education, well, the government should do it. Oh, well, food regulation, the government should do it. Oh, well, defense, obviously, government needs to do that, and arbitration. And, well, roads and transportation, that needs to be the government. If that's your retort, if that's your answer to everything, then at some point you're going to start looking at that institution. And, of course, this wouldn't just be for government. If you said the Catholic Church should do it, the Catholic Church should do it. At some point you have to just start saying, well, look, I believe in the Catholic Church, or I believe in the state, and since it's the utilitarian solution to every end I can imagine, then it's an end in and of itself. Now, this is somewhat akin to libertarians who will say the market should do it. The market should do it. But there's a difference because government is an institution, and the market is the description of a process. Okay, so when we say the market should do it, it doesn't mean that 10 guys in a smoke-filled room wearing top hats and monocles run everything. It's a description of the process that takes place when people are free to choose, to steal a term from a decently free market, if not Austrian economist. The government is a specified institution, and to create that as the wellspring or the focus of society imbued with all the powers necessary to control society entails enormous moral hazard and also suffers from the economic calculation problem, the knowledge problem, the incentive problem. To say it'd be one thing if we say evolution should take care of it, and we just mean the biological process. It's another thing if there's a board of directors called evolution, and we say, well, evolution should decide, and then they get to dictate who gets what genomes, who mates with who. Those two scenarios are not analogous. So it's not really analogous, other than in a very, very generalized semantic sense, to say that libertarians are appealing to the same thing over and over again in the same way that, say, someone who's appealing to the government always is, because the government and the market are fundamentally different conceptually and in practice. But for a liberal who's, the government should do this, the government should do that, the government should do this, eventually they're going to end up, philosophically, if not explicitly, but at the very least implicitly, state power is good. And so when they see somebody exercising state power, even if they don't necessarily agree with how they're using it, they can still say, well, but that's a good thing because we need state power. And this is kind of the retort whenever you point out something that is an obvious abuse. If you talk to a liberal and you figure out something that they really don't like that the government's doing, they're just going to pass it off and be like, well, yeah, it makes a mistake here, but we still need that power. The government needs that power because the government's the solution to every other problem I can think of. I used to be this way too. When, at the beginning of my political philosophy, I didn't know the term, but it was essentially socialism. Was if you had proposed a problem to me, I'd say, well, the government should do it. If there's and it would have been for me, it would have been poverty and the environment. Like, oh, the environment's going bad. Well, obviously the government needs to do, make national parks everywhere and put in one-child policies and massive reductions in consumption. I would have actually supported all that stuff when I was a little kid. And then I started to, realize that there's a cost to government power, that there are consequences to that, unintended ones and intended ones, and that failing to weigh those into consideration when you advocate a government program, government power is, totally silly. You've got to take those into consideration, and once you start to do that, it becomes a whole lot beneficent, and it becomes a whole lot less, oh, this is a great idea, and more, I don't know, it's kind of shady. But, liberals don't get to that point usually. They just, knee-jerk, the government should do it. Well, we see with their veneration of Father Abraham, that they really, racism, sexism, bigotry, fascism even, as we see in contemporary society, these are not as important as having government power, at least to the majority of liberals. Yes, there are exceptions, and, I'll give the credit where credit is due. Cenk Unger is a really annoying blowhard, but at least I'll criticize Obama for some things. And, Glenn Greenwald, really, he's off the charts in terms of, how principled he is when it comes to civil liberties. He's dead wrong about economics. I just read one where he was kind of defending Paul Krugman. At least it's like, okay, well, yeah, definite detention and execution without trial or any due process whatsoever. Yeah, that's a non-starter for him. But for most liberals, it's like, yeah, I wouldn't like that, but, he's giving welfare to poor people. So, maybe it's all right if he kills some people on the side. I'm really not going to complain too much. So I think that's what the Lincoln cult really illustrates. The De Lorenzo has pointed this out as well. Basically, the cult of Lincoln is a vicarious cult, or is used in position or in replacement of government. The big statue of Lincoln, it's not a statue to Lincoln so much as it's a statue to the federal government, to its central role in society that it perceives itself to have, and that it wants everyone else to perceive it as, even though most of our day-to-day lives aren't going through the federal government, and its main effect on most of us is to tax and impede our livelihoods, sometimes to a lethal effect, although that's generally not the case, but sometimes. What's kind of ironic about Glenn is, he's worried about drone strikes and all these, and it's true, that's terrible and tyrannical and it's evil, but, the total numbers of people, even if we count everybody killed in the wars that Obama's killed, just the people who die on the margin because of government policy in the United States, like because of FDA preventing drugs from coming in, is greater than the number of people who are dying in the war, certainly the number of people who are getting killed by drone strikes from the signature of the president. So that's kind of a little, he drone struck, he's killing people with drones, but then he should, regulate the economy, and that regulation, reduces wealth in society, and it causes people on the margins to die, and probably more people than what he's talking about in terms of the war. I'm not trying to minimize the war. I'm just saying, hey, maybe we should realize that, even the good government is, greases its wheels with blood of the innocent, and the plunder of the living, plunders all of us immensely to our great disadvantage. And I don't know. So even though Lincoln is demonstrably a racist, people don't want to believe it. They don't want to talk about it because they worship federal power. They love a winner. Even though someone like FDR was clearly an invalid who wanted war, who callously um, caused the deaths of millions of people just to sate his own ego and desire to become a quote-unquote great president, which was also a motivation for Abraham Lincoln. Actually, he talks about that just the part I just read. What makes it so complex about Lincoln is, like many presidents, and this is true of just about everybody who gets into the office, people get to be, you don't get to be president on accident. You get to be president because you want to be president. With the exception of possibly some of the vice presidents who became president when the president was assassinated. It's conceivable that somebody could be made vice president when they really weren't super interested in the idea, and then they became president after the president was killed. But I don't think that's the case. I mean, maybe with Johnson, not LBJ, but the one who became president after Lincoln. Maybe him. And who came president after William Henry Harrison? I don't know. But not LBJ and not TR, because they were both fucking bloodlusty for the job like crazy. But so maybe those two. But otherwise, I'd have to check. I don't know who was it. Polk? Who became president after Harrison died? I don't remember. He probably had political ambitions too, and I'm sure Johnson did also. Johnson was given that because there was a conciliatory effort to the South. And he may not have really wanted it, which would make him unique among presidents, but I don't know that for sure. All the other ones, they wanted to be president, and they wanted to be president for some kind of reason, and the reason is never because they think that they can make society better in some way. It's because they want to be famous, they want to be powerful, they want to have a legacy. They realize that that's the easiest ticket to do it. FDR, if you look... If you look at his policies, especially regarding the Great Depression, they don't show that he acted on any kind of consistent ideological framework. He wasn't a socialist, he wasn't a fascist, he was, I got elected, I want to try and prove myself, I'm going to fight the Depression, I'm going to do whatever it takes. So he might be favoring the unions and socialism one day, and the next day he's favoring big business through corporations and cartelization. Whatever he thinks might make him famous, and when he realizes that there's a war, World War II is going to start and has started, he realizes that's his ticket. Quite truly, correctly, he's going to be the president during the war, even though he didn't cause the war, the outbreak of the war. He's not going to be a general on the field who's actually going to have to display any kind of martial skill whatsoever, or bravery. Certainly not. He's going to get the credit, as indeed he does. His name is more associated with it than Ike or MacArthur or Patton or Stimson or anybody else, Cordell Hull, any other people in the American government who probably deserve more credit for winning the war than he does. But since he was the president, he gets all of it. That's a predictable result, and so he wanted to have a war because he knew that he would go down in history, and he has. He was right. History doesn't always reward the winners and the people who deserve it. Sometimes it rewards people who were terrible, like FDR. Now Lincoln was cognizant of this reality. Now, that doesn't mean he wanted to start the Civil War, although John Denson has argued as much, and there's a fair number of conspiracy theories regarding Lincoln and Fort Sumter and how all that went down. He basically wanted it to be a shooting war rather than a negotiated peace, which the South was trying to have, could have had, should have had. If he really cared about slavery, he could have said, I'll let you leave the Union, but you can free your slaves. How about that? I mean, that would have been an interesting thing to try. It probably wouldn't have worked, but that would have been the Lysander Spooner approach, I suppose, maybe. But yeah, he told people, look, I know that I'm going to go down in history, and he was cultivating that image as much as possible. But it was really hard because he was a racist bigot, and he realized that I think history would go against slavery, but he was more concerned with other things. He was more concerned with nationalism. I think he's one of those people in the late 19th century who were looking around America and saying, this place has more potential than any of the powers of Europe. That Germany, England, we all talk about them, France, we talk about them like they're the big empires. But really, the superpower status of America is evident to anybody who cares to look. And I think Lincoln's one of those people who did and was like, this could be really something. Not good, though, evil. And people have thought this all along. They're fucking Rosicrucians who were saying this back in the 17th century, but look at, I think Alexander Hamilton thought this way. It wasn't until the progressive era where basically there becomes a political movement to say, hey, let's harness the power of this fucking continent, the richest society that's ever existed. Let's harness that power and let's use it for statecraft. And of course, the result has been the worst century in human history ever. And the United States, although not solely responsible for that by any means, has played a major role in that bloodbath. And Lincoln, of course, you can't really blame him for that, but I think he was coming from a similar perspective as the later progressives, people like Woodrow Wilson. Even though they're in different parties. But they were both racist also, just Lincoln was much more racist than Wilson was. And interestingly enough, liberals are willing to criticize Wilson about being racist. I've heard several of them say, oh, don't put Wilson on us, he's racist. Well, I never hear them say that about Lincoln. And I think the reason is because he is the founding father of the hegemonic state. We have the whole founding fathers. Before that, it's a confederation. These are independent states. The Sovereign States is a popular book that I highly recommend. The Sovereign States talks about. Lincoln basically makes it from these United States, or the United States are, to the United States is. He changes it to a hegemonic central government that lords over the states as opposed to an actual balance of power constitutional government. And for that, he has become the liberal god. Not because he freed the slaves, not because he was against racism, because he wasn't against racism, and he didn't free the slaves. It's because he created the institution that is the sacred cow of liberals and conservatives, but for different reasons. And I think that's very, very instructional. So, and I just, people talk about, you don't only have to read libertarians. This guy is obviously not a libertarian, but he has something worthwhile to say, at least in terms of the ideology of Abraham Lincoln. Not in terms of, reparations or whatever, but, you take what you can get. Just roll your eyes. That's not what the main book is about. And it's a story that needs to be told, and it's also a great argument point. Because if you can come up and say, look, Lincoln was a total, racist, blah, 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 and you have the evidence, they're left with the position of they have to continue to support him or they have to reassess the deification that he is typically given. Literally, and the radical Republicans really even tried to do this explicitly right after. Like, it would be like, when a president dies, his party is going to try and basically create a martyr out of him. And that happened with Lincoln just like it's going to happen to anybody, but the circumstances were such that it just amplified the power of those that deification process. Like, this is a guy who basically rolled the wave of history to superstardom, to immortality, to the ranks of there's only a couple of historical figures, Jesus, Hitler, Caesar, just a handful. He's probably up there in the top 10. I'm talking in the world, not just in the United States. In the United States, he's got to be one or two. And the title of the book, Forced into Glory, it wasn't because his force of will, strength of character, and moral impeccability. It was his luck and he was brilliant. He was a genius, but he didn't want to bring egalitarianism, whether that's good or not. It's a separate question. But he believed in white supremacy. He didn't want to really end slavery, as he said in his first inaugural. To save the Union, I'll do anything. He believed in state power, just like locals do, and he died for it. I think quite literally, that's what he was killed for, and that's why liberals love him, and they'll continue to love him, even when another liberal, not a libertarian, points out that he was racist, because that's not as important to them as worshiping the government. So I think I've reiterated that point about as much as I can, and I will see you all later.